Kairete Pontes, welcome back. So this week we'll be starting to work with first declension nouns, the feminine definite article, and our next vocab set. And at the end of the lesson, our teaser will be looking at a sentence that has a first declension noun, part of the ace subcategory. And I know that sounds kind of ominous right now, but this will all make sense later. Let's jump right in. Okay. Just like in Latin, we can determine a Greek noun's function in a sentence based on its case, unlike in English where we would use the noun's position to determine its function. We're going to think of declining nouns in Greek very similarly to the way we decline them in Latin. So for every Greek noun we encounter, we'll add endings to a stem to show gender, number, and case. And just like in Latin, we are going to have masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns that can be singular or plural, but as for cases, we're going to see nouns that are nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and vocative. I know, it's kind of weird without an ablative, but really what's happened is that everything that we associate with being an ablative usage is split to other cases. This will make more sense as I go through each case. So let's get started. Okay, for long alpha stem nouns, the nominative singular is alpha, and a noun in the nominative is going to be the subject of a sentence, or just like in Latin, can appear after a linking verb as a predicate nominative. Like if we say, you are my friend, both you and my friend would be nominative. Next, genitive singular is os, alpha, sigma. And genitive is used for nouns modifying other nouns in a sentence. This will often take the form of, like literally the word of, in our translations. And I think the most obvious example of that is possession, like when we say, the book of the girl, for example. So far so good, right? What might be unexpected here is that genitive takes on a couple of the ablative's expected uses. When we're using nouns to denote source or place from which, like with prepositions that mean out of or away from, we use the genitive. Okay, on to our next case. Dative singular ending is alpha with an iota subscript, and the macron's still there. And I hinted at this iota subscript in an earlier video, and there's not that much that you need to know about it other than rather than have a separate iota next to the alpha in the dative, we just use the subscript instead, like instead of having something like that. And that also means that you can't leave the subscript off and just have an alpha, or else you might think your noun is nominative or vocative. As for translation, dative is commonly translated as to or for the noun, but is also part of our substitute for the ablative. If anyone's curious, the dative is actually technically a substitute for the Indo-European instrumental and locative cases, but we're just going to think of it as part 2 ablative replacement because I think that's what's more comfortable for most of us. So, that is all for dative. And now accusative. Accusative singular is on, alpha nu, and the accusative is just translated as whatever the noun is, because think of it as a direct object in Latin, just the same way accusative would be translated in Latin. Okay, I'm going to wait to do vocative until we've done the plurals of nominative through accusative, so on to the plural. Nominative plural is I, alpha iota. Genitive plural is own, omega nu. Dative plural is ice, alpha iota sigma, and accusative plural is os, alpha sigma. And now let's look at the vocative. For first declension nouns, the vocative matches the nominative exactly. So here your vocative singular will be a alpha and plural I alpha iota. And technically there's a macron right there. Okay, now that we've gone through the long alpha stem endings, let's take a look at nouns with eta stems. Same process, and I'm not going to go through how the cases are used again because it's the exact same thing. We just have different endings now. So nominative singular is a eta. Genitive is ace eta sigma. Dative is a eta with an iota subscript. And the iota subscript is placed in the equivalent place on the eta as on the alpha, so right under it and facing to the right. And then accusative is eta nu. And now plural. Nominative is I alpha iota. Genitive is own omega nu. Dative ice alpha iota sigma. Accusative os alpha sigma. And for vocative, like I said, the forms match the nominative here. So in the singular we have a eta, and in the plural I alpha iota. And here there's again technically that macron. So you might have noticed that the plural forms are the same for nouns of either alpha or eta stem. Just be careful then in those cases where you have a noun with an eta stem in the plural that you remember it's not actually a noun with an alpha stem, just in case you have to then make the noun singular or recognize its dictionary entry. But it's really not that complicated. It's more just recognizing nouns and knowing what their original stems are. Now let's move on to the definite article, which we translate like the word the in English. So the nominative singular is he, eta with rough breathing, specifically it has to be rough, and genitive is tace, so tau eta sigma with a circumflex over the eta. And dative is tice, wait, that's plural, just kidding. Dative is te, sorry, with an iota subscript and a circumflex over the eta again. An accusative is tain, tau eta nu, and that has an acute on the eta. Then for the plural, nominative is high alpha iota with rough breathing on the iota because, with rough breathing on the iota because that is a diphthong, so a proper diphthong, so we place the breathing mark on the second vowel in the diphthong. Then genitive is tone, tau omega nu, with a circumflex over the omega. Dative is tice, which I was apparently so excited for earlier that I couldn't help but tell you. And it has a circumflex on the iota. An accusative is toss, with an acute and a macron on the alpha. But remember that with both the singular and plural accusative forms, that acute is going to flip to a grave whenever there's a word following this article, and because this is a definite article, we know there's always going to be a word after it. You're not going to get a sentence like, we were playing with the, and then that's it. Like, there's going to be a word after the. And so this accent, both here and here, is going to flip to become a grave. Now that we've learned all that, let's look at a couple examples. Before we really get into it, I want to take a look at this word, hora, and its nominative form, so we can determine how to and where to use our accent. So, let's just write it here. Hey, hora. Oh. Oh my goodness. You know what? Okay. Hora. Okay. So, for Greek nouns, the accent is called persistent because it wants to stay in the same place as you decline the noun. And the accent may be forced to move to another syllable or change its form in certain conditions, but what's really important for you to do is memorize the location of the accent in a noun's nominative form. And there are a couple peculiarities with accenting nouns that I'll go through as we decline this example and the next one, but for now, let's just focus on this word. So here we see from our prompt, basically, that there's an acute on the omega. So we're going to leave that there, and because this is long alpha stem, we put a macron on our alpha. Now, genitive, for our article, we have tes, like I just said, with that circumflex, and then horos, with the alpha sigma as your genitive ending. And so we're going to keep the acute and also keep that macron on the alpha. For dative, we have te with an iota subscript and a circumflex, and then hora, alpha with an iota subscript. The acute stays there, and we retain the macron there. Then for accusative, we have tain with what we learned was an acute, but we also learned that when a word follows, like horon in this case, then that acute flips to a grav. So really, tain looks like that, and then we retain the acute there and the macron there. Oh, that was not a very nice macron, but you get the idea. On to plural. We have hi for our definite article, then horai, and horai is kind of weird because that acute changes to a circumflex. Not really going to explain that. There are certain things that happen because of specific accenting rules, a couple that I mentioned in lesson 2 if you want to go back and review that, but accenting nouns is relatively complicated, and in my Greek class, we actually did not accent any of our nouns because it's complicated, and I think that that's totally fine for a beginning class. Like, what's really important is your accents on your articles and on verbs. So if you're not really understanding why certain things are changing with nouns, don't worry about it. We're actually starting next lesson. We're going to stop focusing on accents on nouns. But if you're still curious and do want to use them correctly and continue to develop your accenting knowledge, talk to me because I'm also learning and I'm also wanting to know more. So yeah, feel free to reach out if you want, but if you're stressed about how many different accenting rules you're learning, don't worry because it is going to get easier as we go along. Anyways, next genitive plural is tone for our definite article with that circumflex there, and then horon for our genitive plural of hora. And this is one where the accenting rule is relatively simple because it's true for all of these nouns that we're going to be using. So the genitive plural will change to a circumflex on the ultima regardless of where that initial accent was. So like here with hora, we have the accent on the penult, and it's an acute. Doesn't matter. In the genitive plural, the syllable that gets the accent is always the ultima for first declension nouns, and because of this contraction thing that happened a long time ago, this would have initially actually had an alpha here, and that's what made there be a circumflex when the alpha cut out. I'm not really going to go into that, but if you want to know, again, reach out and I'll explain. But all you have to know for now is that you're going to put a circumflex over the omega in your genitive plural for these nouns we're working with. Okay, dative plural is tice for the definite article with the circumflex over the iota, and then horice. What an interesting word. Horice, and there we have the acute again on the omega, and then accusative plural, tas. Ooh. Tas, and then this is another instance where we have that acute followed by another word, so it becomes a grav, and then horos. Okay, so that is it for nominative through accusative. And with vocative, pretty straightforward. Like we learned, the forms of the noun are going to match exactly to the nominative forms. And with vocative, there is no article that we're going to consistently use, but there is this interjection O, which we'll use a lot of the times with vocative, although it's not technically necessary. It's not an article like hey here. So we have hora and horai. Okay, that is it for hey hora. And now let's move to our second example, which is hey skene. Okay, just going to go through the same process. Nominative singular, we have hey for our definite article, and then skene for our noun. Then tes as our genitive singular definite article with the circumflex over the eta, skenes. Okay, now is our second peculiarity for accenting first declension nouns that I mentioned earlier. So for eta stem, or actually just for first declension nouns in general, if you have an accent on the ultima, so if you have an acute there like this, here, that acute is going to change to a circumflex in the genitive and the dative in both the singular and the plural, but that's only if that accent falls on the ultima in the genitive and dative. I hope that makes sense. So if I get rid of that circumflex, normally we would be drawn to write an acute on the ultima because that retains the position of that initial accent we learned in the nominative, but because of this peculiarity, we are not going to write an acute, we're going to write a circumflex. All right, on to dative. Te with an iota subscript and a circumflex, and then ske ne with an iota subscript and a circumflex. Then for accusative, tain, and again that's going to flip, so that acute becomes a grav, and then ske nain. And now we flip back to having an acute again, because we're no longer in the genitive and dative. For plural, hi, skenai. I know, it looks a little bit weird because we're now used to seeing all these etas in the singular, but the same is true. We keep the accent where it was, or at least in the equivalent spot, so we're going to accent that iota on the I diphthong. then tone with a circumflex over the omega, and skenon. And there, the same rule applies, and we put a circumflex over the omega. Dative plural is tais with a circumflex over the iota, skenais. Same thing, we put a circumflex over the iota because of our rule with the genitive dative thing with accents falling on the ultima. Then accusative, tas, with an acute, but the acute flips to a grave because there's a word following it. Skenas. And here, that os ending is long, plus we've got an accent on our ultima, so there's the acute. Then for vocative, again, we can use this interjection if we would like, and then we just get skene, and we have an accent on the ultima, and skenai, and we have an accent on the ultima again. That is it for our practice examples. There will be more practice to do in the worksheet for today, which is linked down below, but I did want to go through a couple with you guys so that you could get a better feel and see me do it too. All right, that is all for the grammar aspect of today's lesson, so we're going to move on to our second vocab set. And this set can also be found at the end of this week's lesson worksheet for quick access when you're doing the practice after the lesson. We'll start with verbs. We have pempo, which means to send, then didasko, teach, krino, separate, choose, or judge, and whenever I give more than one definition, just pick the one that makes the most sense contextually or that is the easiest for you to remember, whatever helps you. Then we have heurisco, which means to find, lambano, which means to take, receive, grasp, or understand, any of those. So those are our 5 verbs for this week. Not too bad, I just think they're fun verbs. Okay, for our nouns, we have agora, which is long alpha stem. So for nouns, the dictionary entry is going to look like the Greek equivalent of what we would normally consider a dictionary entry in Latin. So we have still the nominative, and then we have the genitive singular, or at least the genitive singular ending when you're writing it, if you just want to write that, and then the gender. And here, technically, hey is not like writing F, like it doesn't mean feminine, but it is the feminine definite article, so it denotes a feminine noun. And because we're always going to be using that article with the noun, we're not just going to have the noun on its own, it's a good way to keep checking yourself and also building up that memory of associating hey with feminine nouns, with first declension, all of this being connected. Okay, epistole, ace, hey, is a letter or message. And then hesuchia is leisure, stillness, or tranquility. Thea is goddess. And Thea is pretty cool because, so you know how we talked about the ultima having an accent means that the genitive and dative will have a circumflex instead of the acute. So here we would expect to see a circumflex like we do, but what's also interesting is that there's no longer a macron, right? Because we have a macron on Thea, and you'll see it on its other forms, like the accusative singular is theon with a macron still, but you're not going to see a macron where there's a circumflex. I did talk about this back in the accents lesson 2 video, but if you have a circumflex, you're also not going to see a macron in the same place because the circumflex already tells you that the syllable is long. I just think that's really cool to see what we're talking about be directly applied. So the next noun is skene, which means tent, and we use that in our practice. And the last one we also used hora, which is land, country, space, or position. Now we're going to do our first prepositions. We have 3 pretty simple ones that we'll be using throughout the year. They're very helpful and honestly kind of fun, I think. So we have ace, which takes the accusative, and it means into or to. And even when you have a preposition, you're still going to use that definite article, like here, after the preposition and before the noun. Then we have ek or ex, which takes a genitive and means out of. This is like what I was talking about, where the genitive is now denoting source or place from which, whereas the ablative would in Latin. So we're just going to use this preposition to show that. Then we have en, which means in, takes a dative. This also makes sense based on how we talked about using the dative for place where. So it's all pretty straightforward. You just have to memorize these 3 prepositions. Then for interjections, I mentioned this earlier, we are going to use o, which is just an omega with smooth breathing and a circumflex over it. It just means o, but it's important to understand this is not like our surprised oh, like oh, it's like oh, the gods type of thing. I'm not sure if that really makes sense, but I think as you continue to read Latin, you see this more frequently. It is that use, if you know what I mean. So it is an interjection of like, oh, the things, not oh. I don't know how to differentiate any better, but I hope that makes sense. If not, I hope that was entertaining. Okay, the last thing we're going to do is our teaser. This is just one quick sentence, and let's just get into it. Okay, so our subject is thalata, and we have that definite article before it. So, hey, thalata, or thalata technically. This is the sea, and this sentence does not really make sense. You know, we're going to have a lot of sentences that don't really make sense, but it's okay. I just thought it was fun because of all the thetas in it. That's the best explanation I can give for how I created the sentence. Okay, so then thue is our verb. So that's from thuo, to sacrifice or slay. Then we recognize the nu on the ends of these as accusative. So we have tain theon as our direct object. And then we see these eta sigmas, and we know that those are genitive forms. So tes thalates is modifying tain theon. So now let's translate it. He thalata is the sea, thue sacrifices, tain theon is the goddess, and then tes thalates is of the sea, because this is genitive, we're using of. So we have the sea sacrifices the goddess of the sea. We're not going to think about what that might mean, but instead we're going to focus on what is happening with thalata, because you might have picked up on this being an alpha and this being an eta, and that doesn't really make sense at first glance. But all I'll tell you for now is that this is the same word. This is the same as that. It's just the lata has a mixed declension, so it's still first declension, but it's has an alpha in certain forms and an eta in others. This will make a lot more sense once we actually go through how to decline fully, but just know that there are going to be a couple forms where you'll see an eta, where you'll think there should be an alpha, or the other way around. Just try not to get confused, and yes, these are the same words. So I hope that gets you excited for what we'll be learning next week. And until then, make sure to check out the practice worksheet linked down below, and that will help you practice with the definite article declension and with declining both alpha and eta stem nouns. So until then, thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.